Welcome back, everyone. Today I'm going to share with you two books that I recently finished reading. It wasn't like yesterday. It was more like a couple weeks ago when I finished the last pages and scooted them to the side. But I'm hoping that I can pique your curiosity enough that you'll want to acquire a copy of these for yourself. All you have to do is click on the links in the description below. Now, the very first one that I want to talk about is The Great Bridge by David McCullough. David McCullough is my favorite history writer. A lot of history books are very thick, just like this one. It's 564 pages. And in many of them, you can get slogged down by the details. But David McCullough is not like that. I've read his book, A Path Between the Seas, about the building of the Panama Canal, and 1776, and also his biography on John Adams, and probably a few other books that I can't recall at the moment. But he relays a story in a very easy to understand and compelling way at the same time. So I highly recommend him. If you've ever seen any interviews with him, he looks like the kindest, sweetest gentleman you'd ever want to meet, but he passed away a couple of years ago. And so I'm glad that he has left behind an illustrious volume of books for us to read, giving many different accounts of many different people and events. But this one is about the building of the Brooklyn Bridge. This was written I guess I would say it published in 1972. So it was only when I was 2 years old when it was put out. So it's been around for quite a while. Okay, so the Brooklyn Bridge. I've never been to New York City. I do want to go, and I'm so thankful that I've read this because when I go someday, this is going to be the highlight of my visit, I think, because I just don't think a lot of people understand what it took to make this happen. Okay, so I have a friend who used to live in Brooklyn. He grew up around there, I guess. And he said, I've traveled across that thing just like millions of other people so many times. I just never thought about it, just took it for granted. But I think that no matter where you're from, that you're going to love everything about this. Now, here's what it says on the back of the book. I'll just give you a quick rundown here and a few thoughts. It says, this monumental book is the enthralling story of one of the greatest events in our nation's history during the age of optimism, a period when Americans were convinced in their hearts that all things were possible. And it really was that kind of an age. In the years around 1870, when the project was first undertaken, the concept of building an unprecedented bridge to span the East River between the great cities of Manhattan and Brooklyn required a vision and determination comparable to that which went into the building of the great cathedrals. Throughout the 14 years of its construction, the odds against the successful completion of the bridge seemed staggering. Bodies were crushed and broken, lives lost, political empires fell, and surges of public emotion constantly threatened the project. But this is not merely the saga of an engineering miracle. It is a sweeping narrative of the social climate of the time and of the heroes and rascals who had a hand in either constructing or exploiting the surpassing enterprise. John A. Roebling was the engineer behind the building of the Brooklyn Bridge. I mean, it was his idea. He was crossing by ferry one day, which is the only way to get from Manhattan to Brooklyn at the time. And it was very cold. It was iced over. The river was iced over, and he was kind of frustrated. And one thing you got to know about Roebling was he was a German immigrant. He considered himself a farmer, but he was also an engineer, had a wire company also. He was very brilliant. He had a vast knowledge of so many things. But he was crossing the East River. It was frozen over. He was kind of, feeling impatient probably. And he said to himself, you know what would solve this problem? A bridge. I'm going to build a bridge. Now, I'm always enamored by people in history who have an idea and they just act. They see a need, they fill a need. They just don't waste any time. They are extremely driven, and I'm thankful that we have them out there. If I ever think that I'm driven, all I got to do is read about these guys, and I realize I can't hold a candle to them. They're absolutely fascinating to read about. But in 1869, when John Roebling stepped out onto the site where the bridge was going to be built, I think it was like in the first day or first couple days, something like that. I can't remember the details perfectly. My mind's not completely accurate on that, but he had a tragic accident. His foot became crushed because of something that happened there. And It was so bad. I mean, it was extremely bad. And as he was passing out, he was still barking out orders. They rushed him to a doctor. The doctor tried to say, hey, this is what I think we need to do. I think it was probably to amputate, but I can't remember it. But the doctor tried to give him advice, and he didn't want to take his advice. John Roebling had his own ideas. That's the thing about smart people, brilliant people like this, is oftentimes they have their own ideas about how things should work. They don't listen to anybody else. And he didn't. He had this own water rinse treatment he wanted to give it, and he thought that would work. Well, it didn't. He got tetanus, and he died. I mean, before anything even ever happened. So he's kind of like Moses in the Promised Land. He took the people all the way to the edge, but he didn't go over. Somebody else had to do that, and somebody else did in this case. His son, Washington Roebling. He was brilliant in his own rights. He was no slacker. He was a colonel in the Civil War. When he came back, he took over the project. But he also had to live in his father's shadow. And no one thought he was going to live up to the person that his father was. But he was actually, in my opinion, through reading the book, what I believe is he was better than his father. He was greater than his father. Although it wouldn't have happened without his dad. Okay? But if you've ever been someone who's felt like you've lived in the shadow of another person, you'll probably appreciate this, because Washington, even though, and in fact, he was named Washington because he was named after Washington Irving, okay? But even though he was up against so much, he was still unstoppable. He didn't let anything hold him back. And he certainly was up against a lot, as the back of the book here that I just read indicates. The political machinations, the manipulative the manipulative media at the time, which was the newspapers, they all did their best to discredit and destroy every attempt to make this happen. Not only them, but the people of Manhattan and New York. I think New York City wanted it to happen more than Manhattan did, because Manhattan wanted to kind of stay isolated away from New York City. They saw them as the riffraff. But it was going to happen anyway, and as you can see, it did. But the technology that they had back during that time blows me away. I had no idea that they could even do the things that they did. And the stories that are within the layers of this book will just keep you mesmerized. I just can't say enough. I think David McCullough, I don't think he could have been topped. I feel the same way about his book, A Path Between the Seas, which is about the building of the Panama Canal. I love anything he's written. And I think you will too if you like history. So pick this up. I will say one of the brightest luminaries of this book was Washington Roebling's wife, Emily. What a beautiful, and when I say beautiful, I don't mean by appearances. There's only like one picture I think I saw of her. But I'm talking about who she was on the inside. What a beautiful person. What a strong individual. Without her, the Brooklyn Bridge probably never would have been finished the way it was. It was such a glorious story. Washington himself, because of having to go down to the caissons, which are these superstructures that they're pads, the foundations the bridge is built up on. And the story behind the caissons themselves are just fascinating. But these things were hollow. The men would go down and work inside them and dig away the materials and the riverbed to help the caisson sink. It's kind of hard to describe. You have to see it for yourself. It's just really interesting. But one of the problems they had back then was they would get the bends. The men would go down there. They'd work for a while. When they'd come up, they were coming up too fast, and they were getting the bends. They'd fall over and just be in enormous pain. Some people died from it. Some people didn't. It really just depended. But they didn't understand. They didn't even call it the bends back then. They just called it, I think it was caisson disease. But they were just on the cusp of finding out what that was all about. But before they could, Washington Roebling himself had descended into the caissons a number of times, come back up too fast, and it really affected him the rest of his life. His vision, he had so much fatigue that he had to deal with the rest of his life, and he finished the completion of the Brooklyn Bridge from his home a mile away without ever going to the site, because he couldn't get out of his house. It had held him back that much. getting the bends the way he did. It wrecked his body. Well, anyway, without his wife Emily, it would have never happened. She took notes from him. She'd go to the site, make sure everything was running the way it should, and she became very knowledgeable about the building of the bridge itself because of talking to him so much and making things happen. She was this go-between, but she was probably one of the strongest individuals in all of this. And even the men on the site and the engineers and all the people in the political atmosphere that were behind all this loved her so much because they amazed even them, or she amazed even them. And she, after the building of the bridge was done, she even went on to get a law degree on her own. And this is back in the late 1800s, because the bridge was finished. It was finished being built in 1883. Okay, so everything about this book is just so interesting. I would say it's a definite reread. So check into this for yourself. I do not think you'll be disappointed. The second book I want to share with you is Coolidge. It's about the 30th president of the United States. Here's what it says. It's written by Amity Shlaes. I've never met anybody named Amity. Here she is on the back of the book. And she's written several other books, but let me give you a description of this on the inside cover. Here's what it says. Calvin Coolidge, who served as president from 1923 to 1929, never rated highly in polls. The shy Vermonter, nicknamed Silent Cal, has long been dismissed as quiet and passive. History has remembered the decade in which he served as a frivolous, extravagant period predating the Great Depression. Now, Amity Shlaes, the author known for her riveting, unexpected portrait of the 1930s, provides a similarly fresh look at the 1920s and its elusive president. Shlaes shows that the mid-1920s was, in fact, a triumphant period that established our modern way of life. The nation electrified, Americans drove their first cars, and the federal deficit was replaced with a surplus. Coolidge is an eye-opening biography of the little-known president behind that era of remarkable growth and national optimism. Although Coolidge was sometimes considered old-fashioned, he was the most modern of presidents, advancing not only the automobile trade but also aviation through his spirited support of Charles Lindbergh. Coolidge's discipline and composure, Shlaes reveals, represented not weakness but strength. First as governor of Massachusetts, then as president, Coolidge proved unafraid to take on the divisive issues of this crucial period, reining in public sector unions, unrelentingly curtailing spending, and rejecting funding for new interest groups. Perhaps more than any other president, Coolidge understood that doing less could yield more. He reduced the federal budget during his time in office, even as the economy grew. Wages rose, tax rates fell, and unemployment dropped. As a husband, father, and citizen, the 30th president made an equally firm commitment to moderation, shunning lavish parties and special presidential treatment. To him, the presidency was not a bully pulpit, referring to TR, but a place for humble service. Overcoming private tragedy while in office, including the death of a son, Coolidge showed the nation how to persevere by persevering himself. For a nation looking for a steady hand, he was a welcome pilot. In this illuminating magisterial biography, Amity Shlaes finally captures the remarkable story of Calvin Coolidge and the decade of extraordinary prosperity that grew from his leadership. A lot of people don't know. They have a misconception about the 1920s. It was actually one of the most prosperous periods in our nation's history. She referred here to the death of his son, which was one of the most tragic parts of the whole book. He had a son, Calvin Jr., 16 years old, who had a brother who was a little bit older than him. They liked playing tennis at the White House, okay? And on a whim, they decided they were going to go outside and play tennis, but Calvin Jr. didn't put on his shoes. He went out barefoot, but he got a blister on his foot, and it caused him some pain. he got infected. He actually developed a staph infection. They didn't understand that completely back then. And he ended up passing away. And it was such a sobering moment in the book, I had to stop reading and just think about it for a while. And I just can't imagine losing a child while holding such a high public office and having to maintain your composure, which he did. It was very difficult, and he had to deal with it later on. But I just can't imagine. I can't imagine. And they said that if this had happened like 4 years later, it would have been circumvented because they had developed the antibiotic penicillin. And so it's tragic for that too. But I will say that Coolidge, as far as reading about presidents, he's not the most interesting individual because he was very quiet. He was very stoic. He wasn't very dramatic, but he did a lot of great things. So it's, on one hand, you don't have a super interesting individual, but he did some pretty incredible things while in office. So those of you who like presidential history will really enjoy this. This was like 356 readable pages, so it's not as long as The Great Bridge. It's not written anywhere near the same, but I think you'll enjoy both authors. And if you're, I love the cover of this book. This is what drew me to it to begin with. I love reading about presidents, but this is a really cool cover. It's so dapper. Anyway, I enjoyed both those. If you want to pick them up for yourself, if I've said enough to make you interested, let me know. If you've already read these books for yourself, tell me about them. Tell me what your thoughts are. And I think that's the end of this video. I don't think I have anything more to say. I got a busy day ahead of me, so I'm going to get going. I thank you for watching. Thank you for listening and making it all the way to the end. Please hit the subscribe button. I'll catch you guys on the next one. See you later.